My name is Ava Mitchell, and I was 25 years old when my father threatened to cut off my tuition if I missed my sister Brianna's wedding. The funny part? I hadn't needed his money for years. I was sitting in my office in Dallas when his call came through. He didn't ask how I was doing. He never did. "Ava, your sister's wedding is next month," he said. "You'll be there." I told him I would try to arrange my schedule. That answer immediately irritated him. "You'll do more than try," he snapped. "After everything I've spent on your education, you owe this family." There it was again. The same threat he had used since college. Money, tuition, support. As if my future still depended on him. What he didn't know was that I had already paid off every dollar of my student debt myself. No help from him, no help from anyone. But my family never asked about my life. Their attention had always belonged to Brianna, the golden child, the daughter who could never do anything wrong. Meanwhile, I was the daughter who was expected to show up, stay quiet, and be grateful. "If you don't come," my father continued, "don't expect another cent from me." I almost laughed. The man threatening my finances had no idea I earned more in a month than he thought I made in a year. But instead of arguing, I simply said, "I'll be there." He sounded satisfied, like he had won. Then he hung up. I stared at my phone for a moment. Something about the conversation bothered me. Not the threat. That part was almost normal. It was the way he kept mentioning Brianna's fiancé. According to my father, the guy had been helping with family finances, investments, and even some paperwork around the house. My father trusted him completely. And that was exactly what made me nervous. Because in my experience, the people who volunteer to handle someone else's money usually want something in return. At the time, I thought I was just being cautious. I had no idea that one wedding invitation was about to uncover the biggest lie my family had ever believed. I arrived in my hometown 2 days before the wedding. The moment I walked through the front door, I was reminded why I had moved away. Everything revolved around Brianna. Wedding decorations covered every room. Photos of Brianna and her fiancé, Ethan, sat on every table. My mother barely finished hugging me before she started talking about centerpieces and guest lists. Meanwhile, nobody asked how I was doing. Not that I expected them to. At dinner, Ethan was the star of the show. My father couldn't stop praising him. "Ethan's a smart young man," he said proudly. "He's helping me make my money work harder." That sentence caught my attention. My father had never trusted anyone with money, ever. "What kind of investing?" I asked casually. The table went quiet for a second. Ethan smiled. "Oh, nothing complicated. Just helping your parents get better returns." The answer sounded polished. Too polished. People who really understand finance usually explain things clearly. People hiding something usually speak in vague phrases. After dinner, I noticed Ethan carrying a folder into my father's office. A few minutes later, my father followed him. The door closed. Something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was experience. Either way, I couldn't ignore it. Later that night, while everyone slept, I opened my laptop. I typed Ethan's full name into a professional database I used for work. I expected nothing. Instead, I found something interesting. A business company registered less than a year ago. No real office, no history, no track record. Just a mailing address and a very new company. By itself, it meant nothing, but it was enough to make me keep looking. And the more I looked, the less comfortable I became. Because for the first time, I started wondering whether my sister's wedding wasn't the real reason Ethan had joined this family. The next morning, I woke up early and continued digging. The company Ethan owned looked legitimate at first glance, but the deeper I searched, the stranger it became. The business had no real office, no employees, no public client history. Yet somehow, my father trusted it with a large portion of his savings. That didn't make sense. Around lunchtime, I walked into the kitchen and found my father signing paperwork. Ethan sat across from him with a smile on his face. The moment they noticed me, the papers disappeared into a folder. "What's that?" I asked. "Nothing you need to worry about," my father replied quickly. Ethan laughed. "Just helping your dad organize a few things." Organize. Another vague answer. Another red flag. I let it go and poured myself a cup of coffee. But before leaving the room, I noticed something important. One document had briefly been visible before Ethan moved it. I only caught a few words. Property transfer. My stomach tightened. Why would my father be signing property documents 3 days before the wedding? That afternoon, I visited the county records office. Public records never lie. An hour later, I found exactly what I feared. A new loan had recently been taken against my parents' house. The same house my father constantly bragged was completely paid off. The same house he claimed nobody could ever touch. And the paperwork connected directly to a company linked to Ethan. I sat there staring at the screen. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Something was happening. Something my parents clearly didn't understand. The worst part? The wedding was only 2 days away. And if I was right, Ethan wasn't marrying into my family because he loved Brianna. He was marrying into my family because he wanted access to something much more valuable. I drove home with copies of the records sitting on the passenger seat beside me. For the first time, I wasn't worried about being wrong. I was worried about being right. That evening, I asked my father if we could talk privately. I showed him the loan documents. I explained that the house had been used as collateral. I even pointed to the signatures. My father barely looked at them. Instead, he looked at me. "You've always been jealous of your sister," he said. The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, because they were familiar. Whenever I noticed a problem, I became the problem. Whenever I asked questions, I was accused of causing drama. Ethan sat quietly beside him, letting my father do the work for him. It was a smart move. A good manipulator never fights when someone else will fight for him. My mother looked nervous. For a moment, I thought she might support me. Instead, she sighed. "Let's just get through the wedding, Ava. Get through the wedding." As if a possible financial disaster could wait until after cake and dancing. I realized then that nobody wanted the truth. Not my father, not my mother, not even Brianna. They wanted comfort, and Ethan was selling it. Later that night, I found Brianna alone on the back porch. I asked her a simple question. "Do you really know everything about Ethan?" Her smile faded. "He told me you'd do this." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "He said you'd try to turn me against him because you can't stand seeing me happy." There it was. He had prepared for me before I even arrived. He knew someone would ask questions, and he made sure nobody would listen. I looked at my sister and realized she wasn't my enemy. She was just the next victim. As I went back inside, my phone buzzed with a notification from one of the databases I had searched earlier. A new result had appeared, an older business record, different company, different state, but the same man. And the moment I opened it, everything changed, because Ethan wasn't using his original name. I rushed upstairs and opened my laptop. The record was real. 2 years earlier, Ethan had been operating under a different last name. The date of birth matched. The address history matched. Everything matched. Only the name was different. My pulse quickened as I kept reading. That older company had suddenly shut down after investors complained about missing money. No criminal conviction, no arrest, but enough complaints to make any reasonable person ask questions. Lots of questions. I printed every document I could find. Then I organized everything into a single folder. The new company, the old company, the property loan, the name change. Each piece alone looked harmless. Together, they told a very different story. The next morning was the wedding day. The house was full of excitement. hairstylists, photographers, family members laughing in every room. Meanwhile, I sat quietly in the corner reviewing documents. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. My father walked past me wearing his suit and stopped. "Today is Brianna's day," he warned. "Don't start anything." I looked up calmly. "I won't." And I meant it. I wasn't planning a scene. I was planning to tell the truth. There was a difference. A few hours later, the ceremony ended. Everyone moved to the reception hall. Music played, champagne flowed. The guests celebrated. From the outside, it looked perfect. Then, halfway through dinner, Ethan stood and tapped his glass. The room fell silent. "I have a special surprise for the family," he announced. My father smiled proudly. Brianna squeezed Ethan's hand. Then Ethan pulled out a leather folder, and the second I saw it, I knew exactly what was inside. Property documents. The final step. The reason he'd worked so hard to earn everyone's trust. I watched my father reach for the pen, and I realized the moment I had been waiting for had finally arrived. My father took the pen with a smile on his face. The guests applauded. They thought they were about to witness a touching family moment. Only I knew what was really happening. Ethan opened the folder and began explaining how this transfer would protect the family's future. The language sounded impressive, professional, carefully rehearsed. My father nodded along without reading a single page. That was enough for me. I stood up from my table and walked toward the front of the room, slowly, calmly. Every eye followed me. My father looked annoyed immediately. "Ava, sit down," he said. I ignored him. Instead, I placed my own folder on the head table. "Before anyone signs anything," I said, "there are a few documents everyone should see." The room became silent. Ethan's smile disappeared. I opened the folder. First came the property records, then the loan documents, then the business filings. Finally, I placed the page showing Ethan's previous name on top. Nobody spoke, not even Ethan. I looked directly at my father. "The house already has debt attached to it." His face changed. I turned another page. "The company handling your finances isn't what it claims to be." More silence. Then I held up the final document. "And Ethan operated under a different name before this company existed." Gasps spread through the room. Brianna grabbed the paper with shaking hands. My mother looked like she couldn't breathe. For the first time all weekend, my father actually read the documents in front of him. One page, then another, then another. The smile vanished from his face. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him. And suddenly the charming future son-in-law had no explanation ready. The room was waiting. The guests were watching. And Ethan finally realized something terrifying. The person he thought was just the jealous older sister had come prepared, with evidence. And evidence is a lot harder to argue with than feelings. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The entire reception hall felt frozen. Then Ethan laughed. It wasn't his usual confident laugh. It sounded forced, nervous. "You're seriously doing this at a wedding?" he asked. I stayed calm. "I'm showing public records." He looked around the room. These documents don't prove anything, but his voice lacked the confidence it had all week. My father was still staring at the papers. The guests were whispering, and Brianna looked completely lost. Ethan tried one last time to regain control. "Ava has always hated me," he said. "She's trying to ruin our marriage." That would have worked yesterday, maybe even an hour earlier, but not now, because everyone could see the documents. Everyone could see the dates. Everyone could see the signatures. Facts don't disappear just because someone doesn't like them. Brianna turned toward Ethan. "Why did you use another name?" she asked quietly. Ethan froze. The room waited. No answer came. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked again. This time he looked away. And that was the moment everything changed. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't say. Brianna slowly placed her wedding ring on the table. Tears filled her eyes. My mother started crying. My father looked 10 years older than he had that morning. Ethan glanced toward the exit. Then he made a decision. Without another word, he turned around and walked away. Straight through the reception hall, straight past the guest, straight out the door. Nobody followed him. Nobody stopped him. And as the door closed behind him, everyone finally understood the same thing. An innocent man would have stayed. Ethan ran. And the wedding that my family had spent months planning ended in complete silence. After Ethan left, nobody knew what to say. The music had stopped. The guests sat quietly at their tables. My father remained in his chair, staring at the documents spread across the table. For the first time in my life, he looked defeated. Not angry, not proud, just defeated. A few minutes later, he looked up at me. "Ava," he said softly, "what happens now?" The question shocked me. My father had never asked for my help before. He had spent years treating me like the daughter who knew the least. Now I was the only person in the room who understood the situation. I took a deep breath. "We start fixing it," I said. The next few weeks weren't easy. Lawyers got involved, banks got involved, investigators reviewed the paperwork. Some of the money was recovered, some wasn't. But the most important thing survived: the house. The home my parents had worked decades to own. As for Brianna, she was heartbroken. Not because she lost a wedding, because she finally realized she had fallen in love with a version of Ethan that never existed. One evening, several months later, I returned home to help my parents finish the remaining paperwork. When I walked into the kitchen, something unexpected was waiting for me: a homemade chocolate cake, my favorite. Not Brianna's favorite, mine. My mother smiled nervously. We remembered this time. It was such a small thing, but somehow it meant everything. For 25 years, I had been the daughter standing quietly in the background, the daughter who was expected to help but never recognized, the daughter who always came second. That night felt different. Not perfect, not magical, just honest. And sometimes honesty is worth more than an apology. Before I left, my father walked me to my car. The man who had once threatened to cut off my tuition stood awkwardly beside me. Then he finally said the words I never expected to hear. "I was wrong about you." Simple, direct, late, but real. I nodded, because some victories aren't about proving people wrong. They're about finally knowing your own worth. I drove away that night with something I had spent years searching for. Not revenge, not validation. Peace. And that was worth far more than any tuition money could ever buy. A year later, life looked very different. The wedding disaster had become one of those stories people in town still whispered about. But for me, it was no longer the most important part of the story. What mattered was what happened afterward. For the first time, my parents stopped treating me like a backup daughter. They started calling just to talk, not to ask for help, not to compare me to Brianna, just to talk. The change wasn't instant. Trust never rebuilds that way. It happened slowly, one conversation at a time, one visit at a time, one honest apology at a time. Brianna changed too. She started making decisions for herself instead of waiting for someone else to tell her what to do. It wasn't easy, but losing Ethan forced her to see how much of her life had been built around other people's approval. And maybe that lesson saved her from repeating the same mistake again. As for me, I received a promotion a few months later, a major one, the kind that came with more responsibility and a salary that would have seemed impossible when I first left home. When I told my parents, my father didn't change the subject. He didn't compare me to anyone. He simply smiled. "I'm proud of you, Ava." Those 4 words would have meant everything to the 20-year-old version of me. The 25-year-old version appreciated them too. But she no longer needed them. Because the biggest lesson I learned wasn't about money, weddings, or family favoritism. It was this: the moment you stop chasing someone's approval, you finally become free. My father thought he controlled me through tuition money. He thought I still needed permission to build my life. The truth was that I'd outgrown that leash years ago. I just hadn't realized it yet. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who only remember who you used to be. They never notice who you've become until it's too late. And that's how my sister's wedding ended up changing all of our lives. Not because a scammer got exposed, but because for the first time, I stopped asking my family to see my value and started seeing it myself.